Hello everyone, George Costandi here. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to get started right away. We've got a very exciting webinar today. The title is Careless Smoking Fires, Highly Problematic, Easily Preventable. So I just want to run through a couple of quick points with you first. But first, just want to thank you again for joining us, and I hope you and your families are in good health and in safety. And hopefully you guys are getting good weather out where you are. I know out in central Canada, it's beautiful and sunny today and nice and warm. Peter Hamilton, I was just speaking with him, who's based out of Halifax, and he was saying he turned on his heater today. So I turned on my AC, he turned on his heater. So there's quite a bit of different climates, but I hope you guys are all enjoying. So let's jump right into it. I just wanted to let you guys know that there's going to be a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to submit questions via the text box under questions here. Just input your question, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible before the end of the webinar. But in the event that we don't get to your question, we promise to follow up after the fact and by way of email, and we'll answer whatever questions that we couldn't get to before the conclusion of the webinar. As well, just wanted to let you know all questions are going to be anonymously addressed, and all information discussed in the webinar is for educational purposes only and shouldn't be applied directly to the administration of any particular claim. We encourage you to contact a forensic engineer or a forensic expert to talk about the circumstances of a claim or a file that you have, and make sure that the information that you've learned from this applies to that particular circumstance. The webinar is being recorded as well and is going to be posted on our website, LinkedIn, and YouTube pages. So please feel free to pass them on to your colleagues and or use them in team meetings. We're going to be sending you a completion certificate in a follow-up email. Usually takes about a week or so for us to get all the completion certificates. So we ask you, if you don't mind, just be patient with us. We do get to all of them. It just takes about a week. Also, when the webinar concludes and you close the GoToWebinar portal, it's going to prompt you to answer a few questions. I think there's 4 or 5 questions. If you don't mind just giving us your feedback on ranking the speaker, the content, and providing other feedback, that'd be greatly appreciated. If you have any technical difficulties, please email us at webinar@origin-and-cause.com. All right, let's get started. I want to introduce to you our speaker today. So today we have Peter Hamilton joining us. He is the Atlantic Canada Manager, as I'd mentioned before, based out of Halifax. And he's a certified fire and explosion investigator with 20 years of experience with the Toronto Police and 8 years with the Office of the Fire Marshal. He's completed over 645 forensic fire scene investigations, including fire fatalities, large losses, residential, and commercial losses. Peter has also been qualified as an expert witness in both General Division and Provincial Division courts. So I'll pass off the mic to Peter, and thank you so much all for joining us. Peter, take it away.
Well, first, welcome everyone. I'm glad that everyone's had an opportunity to attend today, and I hope that everyone will learn a lot, and the takeaways will benefit everyone across our industry. So we can avoid careless smoking losses that look like these. Fire crews are often called to these type of scenes, and this is what they face. So simply, how did this fire start? What could be done to mitigate the loss? So public education, homeowner awareness, webinars like we're engaged in today are all part of stakeholders' involvements as well here in the understanding of careless smoking. And these ways will help mitigate losses in the future. Let us try to understand the fire as a result of the carelessly discarded smoker's material. Today, smoking is still very common. There are literally billions of cigarettes smoked in a single day around the world. Although we learn the specific elements required for the fire event, to occur. The fires are hard to initialize, and the science today will help us understand that. So when we think of the large distribution of smokers worldwide, then we'll see why the fires do occur. We'll regularly see them as adjusters and investigators and other various components of the stakeholders' fields. So let's get down to it. Cigarettes have a high temperature and a very low energy output. So the output of a cigarette is around 5 watts per ignited cigarette. The average time of consumption is dependent on the user, but ignition to burnout experiments that I participated in, it can be identified. And so for the time to complete a complete length to burnout stage when placed horizontally on a substrate can be in the range of 15 to 20 minutes. So we have to start remembering these things as we're going through this webinar. The cigarette, the most important part, it must include a human interaction, which must also be considered in evaluating the smoldering process. So a simple analogy is this photo is a light bulb, and we remember already that 5 watts per cigarette. So if you had 10 cigarettes, you would have a 50-watt light bulb. So a simple little analogy to try and understand heat output using an analogy with a light bulb. So 921, so the National Fire Protection Agency has a definition in their book. Smoldering is a solid phase burning process which normally includes a thermal decomposition step to create a char, followed by a solid phase burning of the char. So going back to the cigarette itself in that simple definition, we start to break down what an ignited cigarette is all about. So when the puffing stage occurs, so the human interaction with the fuel, it is around 830 to 910 degrees Celsius when you're drawing or inhalation on that cigarette. Once the inhalation stage is completed and it's ash covered over that end of the cigarette, we can drop that temperature down to around 500 to 700 degrees Celsius. And without that inhalation, we're not going to raise that temperature back to between 830 and 910. So those are some numbers that we'll play with as we're moving through the webinar, and they're important to remember. So you need to engage the forensic investigator who understands this phenomena and relate them to the file before you can make any decisions on how to proceed. The ignition sequence of a fire, by definition, is defined as a succession of events and conditions that allow the source of an ignition, the fuel, and the oxidant to interact in the appropriate quantities and circumstances for combustion to occur. So, like any scene, the forensic investigator must understand how that ignition sequence comes together. And in this case, we're going to be studying the smolder wave phenomena. So it may not be simply enough to state the sequence, it must be proven. So it's incumbent on that forensic investigator to understand all of the applicable data and apply it with the rules of fire science, and then complete a fact-based opinion based on the fire science. So the rate of smolder is going to depend on a number of factors, which include, but they're not limited to, the type of the material that the cigarette has been placed into, the configuration and the quantity of the fuel that's being heated by the placed cigarette, the amount of airflow above the surface, the amount of airflow and entrainment from underneath the ignition source and fuel, the type of cigarette and the amount of tobacco remaining when the cigarette meets the fuel, and the density of the fuel. And although that's a lot of material to take in right on the front end, some of those answers can come from statement analysis, your systematic scene excavations, and applying the research that you already know before you go to the fire, and then applying it in your scene. So it's been my experience that the smolder wave occurs on the surface of the porous substrate consuming an isolated volume of fuel downward until such time as air is entrained into the consumed portion, possibly transitioning into a flaming fire. So not every time a cigarette is displaced onto a piece of furniture or into a planter will this occur. There's many different things that have to be considered and evaluated before you can actually say that that's the cause of the fire. For a smoldering fire to occur, these materials must be natural materials, porous, and the entire sequence is ventilation dependent. In this investigator's experience, the smolder occurs on the surface of the porous substrate, consuming that isolated volume of fuel until the air is entrained into the consumed portion, possibly transitioning to an open fire. So it's really an endothermic reaction that's smoldering downwards throughout the material and then results as air entrainment over the carbonaceous char to react into an open flame fire. So only the materials that we can have a carbonaceous char occur on the exterior result of that endothermic reaction can undergo this form of combustion. So they must be natural. Synthetic materials will not allow this phenomena to occur. This is a short video of one of the fires that I went to in the Ontario area while I was stationed there. And this large volume of fire started with one simple cigarette discarded into a planter on a rear deck. So that's everyone's nightmare, from everyone that lives there to the insurance companies to the firefighters who have to come and put it out, to neighbors and everyone involved. So it really shows you how a simple small object like a discarded cigarette with an energy release of 5 watts and a temperature now in a discarded manner, not being inhaled on, can elevate a temperature within a confined medium and smolder down through that medium, break out, and then go into an open flame. And by radiant heat, ignite other materials on that lower deck. And that's where the fire occurs, on the bottom right-hand corner in a planted box. The discard was 2 hours before that video was taken. So outdoor scenes are very common in a fire investigator's life, and knowing how it started and where are the important tools you must understand and carry in your toolbox. Explain it in a common language to the adjuster is key, and that'll help that file come together. So the material must be natural, and it must be porous, and it has to support the smolder wave through the different stages to an open flame. So really, planters and flower boxes are really deceptible. Everybody thinks they're soil contained. However, most planters aren't. Soil really isn't in a planter a good medium to allow that vegetative growth to continue throughout a year. So people are using a natural material, peat moss, that has other ingredients contained within it. So there's fertilizers and there's other additives, as well as the plants themselves decompose, they put further vegetative matter into that planter. So you should understand whether it's this year's material, is it last year's, when was it last watered, what's the weather been like, those type of things. And you can get that from a detailed audio statement from your insured parties. A lot of people really don't think that discard of cigarette into a planter will cause this phenomena, and most times it's not an extinguished cigarette column that's been discarded. They just simply toss it away. So peat moss on its basis has a high carbon content and can burn under very low moisture conditions. Once ignited, the presence of the heat source So the cigarette penetrating that subsurface will begin to smolder. The smoldering fires can burn undetected for long periods of time within your container, depending on the size of the fuel mass contained within that container. And again, when we're talking about the decomposition of the vegetative material within those planters, it can create its own exothermic reactions, so it can start to heat up the materials contained in the planters, and by doing that, it'll reduce the ignition temperature of that peat moss itself. So it can go down to as low as 40 degrees Celsius, causing it to smolder much easier when you introduce a discarded cigarette into it and allow that to transition into an open flame. So when collecting the data, you need to understand the fuel mass, the placement of the fuel within the container, and the material the container is made of. Is it plastic? Is it wood? And how easily is that going to support the combustion process once it reaches an open flame stage? And to understand how the fire occurred in the planter, you need to know the ambient air temperature at the time of the event. So a simple check of our weather channels, we can pull that information in. Again, going back to the moisture content of the material, if you can speak to your insured parties or people that are familiar with that container on the rear deck, ask them when it was last watered. Go back to that weather channel and see when it last rained. Has it been hot, unusually hot? And was that going to help dry out that material and drive that moisture out? Try to understand how much airflow would be moving over our container, and that'll help us support that smolder phase in the material that you're looking at. If the material in the planter can support a smoldering transition, you're going to need to know that. So let's just look at a short video that I have, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so let's run through that again, and I'll provide a narrative to what we're actually seeing. So the male is smoking a cigarette on the rear deck of his mother's house, and that's a very typical scenario on a typical day. If we go back to the beginning of the video, we can see that the last puff is taken on the cigarette, and that cigarette can be seen glowing red. So when we're going back to the temperatures, we know we've got a temperature somewhere between 700 and 900 degrees. We know from the video that there wasn't an extinguishment. This fire occurs in November, so it's not in the heat of the summer. It's actually in November, cooler temperatures. They're dressed moderately heavy, and it seems to be cool. She's adjusting her shirt, and they're both smoking. So these are very natural elements that they're moving through. They smoke all the time, so those cigarettes become almost a complacent thing in their hand. The fuel element is brought up to the elevated temperature there and then discarded into a plastic pail, as we see, and it's placed into a pail with other materials that we come to understand through an audio interview placed in there by the homeowners over the winter. So statement analysis is critical. And so how did that first interview go with them standing on the driveway? Well, they were smoking cigarettes the whole time they were speaking to me. Did they tell the truth? No, they weren't truthful about the actual scenario. They said that the cigarette was discarded into a metal pail and that the pail contained water. So people tend to get very reserved when they're speaking to you about careless discard cigarettes because they think the insurance is not going to cover them. So a good seasoned investigator will look for all these clues and it'll help the adjuster manage the file. So moving on, this is what we actually were faced with on the day of the examination. And this is prior to becoming knowledgeable that there is an actual video to the fire event. So you need to understand your scene. You need to make yourself available to the clients at the scene. You need to reassure them that accidents happen and ask them for honesty when taking the statement. You need to be completely familiar with the science so that you can rebut that statement while you're there. And in fact, I was able to do that. So you need to go back to your scene at the rear of the home and evaluate all of the possibilities and understand your alternate areas of origin. Perhaps what you can't see in this photo is an extension cord that was running across the deck from an exterior outlet. The barbecue that's in that video is within the fire debris, and there's also an outdoor lamp or an outdoor light beside the door under the covered porch. So all of that will help you evaluate the potential hypothesis for the fire. And so how can you assist yourself with the scene and you need to look for videos. Maybe the clients took photos, maybe they took a video. You can ask the neighbors what they saw or heard. I've even gone at scenes and made placards and affixed them to the common mailboxes outside in residential areas, telephone poles, asking people to come forward if they have photos, if they have videos, if they saw the fire. So you can move about your scene and gather information from a lot of different sources. So you need to also understand what the insurance adjuster requires for their file. It may not all be about the science that you have in your head, but you're going to have to understand how they're going to confirm their coverage based on what you know in the scientific data. People are going to want to know if they're covered for this type of exposure from the adjuster and what's the liability for everyone. And is there a subrogation potential based on this fire scene as we see it? And really, what is the cost of this type of fire moving forward? So again, we'll just go quickly back to that scene. We now have that same video. The discarded cigarette has transitioned from a smoldering flame to an open flame. It's breached the pail, which on re-interview, we know now that it's a plastic pail and it contained other smoker's material. The ashtray that they would normally use if seated in those resin-backed chairs is placed on that plastic table. And as you see the radiant heat energy escaping from the fire's growth within the pail, the table drops and now becomes a secondary fuel source. And the photo that we had captured actually the destruction of the back porch as all of those fuel elements on the porch become ignited as the fire grows inside. The entire time this fire was going on the rear deck, the insured was in the home, but in the front living room. So they were oblivious to what was going on the back deck. We were lucky that the home was cameraed in a number of different areas and this video came to light. So the smolder wave takes approximately 1 to 6 hours, depending on the geometry of the fuel in outside potting instances. You have to consider the entrainment of the smolder wave and the materials present in the container. So the geometry of the fuel, the smolder wave within that geometry, and that persistent heat over time. Those are the things that the forensic investigator has to consider. potting soil must have all of the moisture driven off if it's a potting soil condition, and not in like this previous one where it is actually discarded cigarettes. So you have paper, tobacco, and the filters all building up. And depending on the construction of the container, in this case it was plastic, but was it wood or was it plastic? And how does that allow that open flame transition from the smolder phase to really ignite the constructed container itself? And will that play a part as the fire's growth moves away from your container? Some of our containers that are used for planting have already holes placed on the bottom to allow the water to go out, so your vegetative material won't in essence drown in its own water and growth material. Those holes will become important as we'll learn how air entrainment is derived from underneath and pulled over our smolder wave and the carbonation char that's created within that phenomena. This is another example of a carelessly discarded material, and this time it's on a rear deck. And the circumstances in this is it's a townhouse complex located in Ontario. We have a family that was away for the weekend, came home from a camping trip, and when they arrived home, they placed all of their camping supplies on the rear deck. They have a young son who they sent up to have a shower, and dad stood on the back deck and he smoked a native cigarello, and he placed it into a planter on the left-hand rear corner of that deck. And that was around 9 o'clock in the evening. By 11 o'clock, everyone was in bed. The next time that we note through a detailed audio interview is that the son got up at 2 o'clock for a drink of water and then went back to bed. He gets up at 5 o'clock. He has to use the washroom. And when he gets up, his bedroom is located directly above those patio doors. He was drawn to an orange glow on the back deck. His parents sleep on the opposite side of the home, which is the front. He runs into their bedroom and alerts them to something going on the deck. The father runs down and sees through the patio doors a fire spreading from his planter. The planter's made of wood, and he knows that he put that cigarello into that wooden planter. The fire is now in a growth stage, and part of the camping supplies was a 25-liter of gas can containing the remnants of the fuel for the weekend. They have a motorboat. That fire was now impinging on that gas can. He realized quickly he couldn't stop it, and they evacuated and called 911. However, before the fire department could arrive, that fire spread across the deck, contacted the barbecue with a 20-pound propane tank, which then relieved itself. And below the air conditioning unit in the window was a natural gas meter and supply. That was breached by the development of the fire. It then released its contents, and the wooden divider between the homes was ignited, and it subsequently ignited the neighbor's natural gas. So again, something with 5 watts of energy, a reduced ignition temperature placed into the right substrate and allowed to smolder over time. So remembering what the geometry of our fuel is, what the moisture content is, that it's susceptible to clean air entrainment outside. We had a timeline established for 8 hours from the time of discard to the time of fire. So again, something as small and naive looking as a cigarette can really cause a lot of damage. So now let us talk for the remainder of the webinar about furnishings. The most common type of careless smoking fires that involve fatalities are ones that start on upholstered chairs and beds. In these situations, we often go to a scene and find dozens of burn marks on bedding or on couches, where it is evident that the occupants of the home often smoke, drop cigarette ash or cigarettes on their furniture. So what you're seeing is the couch that's developed in a room. It created flashover conditions within that room. So it wouldn't be uncommon to find that the cigarettes have been displaced by the suppression efforts. However, a very fine, meticulous, detailed scene examination using sifters, you will be able to locate those discarded smokers materials, and that'll put you on the right road to understanding if this is a cigarette based phenomena, so smoldering phase transitioning to an open flame. The whole object is a very fine balancing act. Remember, insulation, airflow, and the sequence is very time dependent on a heat and time graph. Information to gather whether there was a fan in the room, was the window open, and how did that air entrainment and air movement within the room affect the time and smolder wave graph. So we know that for every 10 degrees raise of material, so when the smolder wave is occurring and you're raising the temperature of that material, so the fuel element by 10 degrees, we double the amount of decomposition time within that fuel element, and we create our charred surface. We must remember that the first 15-20 minutes are very critical for the smolder wave, and then the next time we need to consider is between 50 and 100 minutes when that actual transition from smoldering to open flame takes place. So quite simply on that slide, you're able to understand that you have two different mediums. They're both organic based, and how the different elements are going to interact on the different mediums. You may have 5 to 6 inches of peat moss, and you may have 5 to 6 inches of polyurethane foam core covered by fabric sheets and pillows. And again, we're going to need to understand where the idyllic placement of that cigarette is upon upholstered furniture, and or the person themselves inside the home. They all have air velocity and temperature considerations at the time of the event, and we all need to understand the moisture considerations both inside the home and out. So when the consideration is given to the material that will allow us to understand if the char was stable and the smolder wave could transition to an open flame with a fresh entrainment of oxygen over that charred area. When you understand the smolder wave versus open flame in the areas of reactions of the material, you're on your way to developing a complete hypothesis. The open flame on a surface and how that differs from a smolder wave, an open flame will travel across the surface of a material, and it will preheat the material as it's moving laterally across the surface, and then those materials will give off a volatile gas and they'll ignite. So it's quite different than the smolder wave, which is a downward transition through the isolated fuel element, whereby you're creating a carbonation char on that material, and then there's an air entrainment from below across the carbonation char, which then opens itself up to a flaming ignition. We do have to remember that these are very hard to recreate. Oftentimes during that recreation or testing phase, an experimental phase, you may not be able to create it each and every time. But if you understand that there are large quantities of people smoking every day, you can extrapolate that on a small test basis over all of those people, it does occur and it does happen. So the smolder wave is a phase that moves downward. We've already discussed that. It's an endothermic reaction. We know that from the previous slides, and we know that we need a velocity of air to entrain itself over that charred surface. So synthetic materials will not allow itself to char, and so we need them all to be natural and synthetic. We need to understand the construction of our cigarette. The cigarette is packed tightly. The manufacturers now place banded pieces within the paper number 2 that holds the tobacco column in it. These bands will slow and retard our cigarettes, and they're prone to go out. Manufacturers have constructed them in such a way that it'll help us aid and reduce some of these smoldering fires by the way the actual cigarette is made. So smoldering is a 3-dimensional fire, and these are the key elements for the investigator to think about. We usually observe the endothermic stage of the smoldering fire in the form of smoke and the byproducts of combustion over time. The smoke can be observed to be a yellowish or white smoke within the room. You can actually put your hand into that developing smoke column. It's somewhere between 50 and 70 degrees in heat value. You won't burn yourself, but in an 8x8 room, in test results, it takes about 28 minutes to start developing smoke within that room to the point that it will become an irritant and restrict your inhalation of air. So when you're doing the interview and you're interviewing someone that says they were in the room, it starts to become critical that you understand how much smoke can be in an 8x8 room, how quickly it develops, and at what points does that room become untenable. So around that 50-minute mark to 100 minutes, that room is untenable simply by the byproducts of combustion that are gathered within it. So we need to understand whether we have new furnishings or old furnishings in that room. Newer furnishings have a higher ion count. The older the furniture, the more that furniture fabric is broken down, and the ions that are within the fabric are older, and they're a lot easier to get going. The newer furnishings are simply a stronger fabric, but they will combust. They will be susceptible to this form of combustion. However, it's a little more difficult. This is just a simple cross section of a chair. You have the upholstered fabric on the outside. There'll be a barrier material placed just beneath that. You'll have some form of polyurethane foam cushioning, whether it's a complete full thickness or if it's just covering the springs on the upper portion, and then there's a void space below it. Placing your cigarette onto the substrate is critical. It needs to be at right angles to those cushions, so along armrests, along the back of the seat. If it's not placed there, then the cigarette needs to be covered with a natural material, so it needs to be insulated from the top to allow it to begin to retain its heat and then smolder downwards. So the smoldering front requires the knowledge of the velocity front. So understanding how that plays a role is very, very important, and know the difference between a smoldering fire and an open flame fire is critical, and how it affects the material in the progression of the event. The angle at which the fuel element cigarette has been placed onto the furnishings, again, we just talked about that, right angles versus flat. If you were to place it flat on the piece of furniture without covering, it will probably go out because the lower portion of the cigarette is occluded from the entrainment of fresh air, and it can't propagate itself into a smoldering transition through those furnishings. It needs to have something covering it. So a natural blanket cotton is probably one of the most readily available materials in blankets and clothing. That will allow it to increase its heat value, and that temperature then will break through the those outside materials, the fabric and the inner barrier, and start to seat itself within the polyurethane foam. And then once it's entrained itself through that polyurethane foam, it's the breakout below and the entrainment of the air across that carbonation char, where the stored heat, so endothermically it's been storing its heat, it's just been charring the outside surface. It then will develop into an endothermic reaction and known as flaming combustion. So you have to know your reference materials and know why the value of 88 minutes keeps popping up. So when people do experiments, there's a specific objective put forth in the testing, and in the value of the quantity of testing over set placements of materials, specific materials that have been introduced. So different forms of natural and synthetic materials. The value of 88 minutes is a mean average for a breakout of fire. So we need to know, is that mattress and box spring, are they on the floor specific, or do they have a simple little bed rail system that keeps them elevated? And how is the air going to differ if it's up on a rail as opposed to down on the floor? Is it synthetic, or is it a natural fabric in the bedding itself? And how do those flame tests, how are they relative to your investigation? You can do simple flame tests as field tests. You should gather some of the material though, however, if there is any left, and have it tested in a laboratory. That'll help you positively identify the materials which the smolder wave had just transitioned through. So if you're able to interview a survivor or an injured person, see what they have to say. And if you already understand the complete science of it, you'll know whether the statement is true. If they say they're in the room at 60 minutes, you'll know that that's a time that's probably not tenable for that person to be in there. So that statement may not be correct. Also look for injuries on them. If they're in that right on the fuel element itself, they should have injuries or burns that are consistent with being in a sitting or laying position, depending on the piece of furniture. How do they articulate that smoke production over a long time? And do they actually talk to you about the smoke? So with some of the information we've gathered today, we understand that how long it takes to fill these rooms, how much smoke is being produced, the colors of smoke that we expect to see, and how hot it would be. So you can use that information and help support and corroborate the statement or rebuke it. We've already spoken that it's inherent to our eyes and respiration. Clothing is something worn on an individual that will have insulation qualities in it itself. Denim seems to be a material that if it's folded and the cigarette lands between or around the denim material, it'll be a good insulated material, and it's prone to a smoldering combustion. So some of the statistics for the adjusters here on the line today. Upholstered furniture is a big fire problem. It accounts for some of the largest shares of fire deaths of any first item ignited in homes in the US. Again, these stats that I've gathered are from US data points. So in 2006 to 2010, home structure fires, so upholstered furniture as the first item ignited accounted for 480 civilian deaths per year. So 19% of all home fire deaths are related to upholstered furniture being the first that ignited. That's pretty high. When you see the cost in money and civilian injuries and the actual structure fires that result, those are some pretty high stats. So we can see how our industry really needs to understand the smoking phenomena, how we need to further educate the public, how we need to get webinars out there, how we need to get all the stakeholders involved, fire departments and everyone, so that we can help mitigate these losses. If we look at this chart, we're seeing that smoldering scenarios form a very large portion of the wheel. In fact, most of it. Equipment failures are lower, as well as all flaming interferences with upholstered furniture are much lower as well. Estimates of upholstered furniture home fire problems increase when the traditional estimates based on items first ignited are supplemented by estimates of fire involving upholstered furniture as the principal item contributing to fire spread, but not the first item ignited. So this is just another way to look at the statistical data collection, but we're still seeing that the civilian deaths are at 24% when we're looking at upholstered furniture as a first ignited item leading to fire spread. So there's 5 major home fire scenarios involving upholstered furniture, plus a 6th scenario with little or no detail that we were able to gather in some of those earlier statistical data collections. And cigarette ignition's right on the top. So smoldering ignition by lighted tobacco products is 45% of the home fire deaths. It is still today one of our major concerns. There's 50 to 70 fire fatalities in Ontario a year, most of which we can put back to smoldering fires. So it's still very high despite all of the efforts that we're going through. So for you, the adjuster, you need to know, is the insured covered for a careless smoking loss? And how does that forensic investigator help with that part of the loss? So it's incumbent on us as forensic investigators to explain to you in a common language and bring that full circle so that you can move forward with the claim. We need to identify all of the elements to bring about fire cause and relate that to you, the adjuster. Is there any liability on this file? So during statement taking and understanding who was at home, is it someone that's just come over to the home for a short visit? Did they drop the cigarette? Did the family drop the cigarette? Are you able to prove that? And who has the liability? Is it the person that came over? Is the homeowner's insurance going to cover that? Or is it the liability insurance that that person brings with them when they enter your home? And so are we able to answer all of your questions? And really, don't be afraid to ask your forensic investigator how this all came together, and actually ask them to provide it to you in very common language. We need to understand, is there subrogation, and can we pursue that? So those are questions that are going to be asked of the forensic investigator. It does come vis-a-vis phone calls later on in the investigations that I'm involved in now, called quite often by subrogation departments, trying to understand who's responsible for that fire. But you cannot allow motive, responsibility, confirmation bias, expectation bias to play a role as a substitute for the science. You must stick to the scientific evidence that you uncover at the scene sequentially, and that's what you need to do at all of your fire scenes. I think we've gone over some of this. Can we ask a forensic engineer, is there any other way it could have happened? Bring that up to them. Ask them to explain the alternate area of hypothesis in the room. Ask them to say why those alternate areas are not a completed hypothesis and why you're just evaluating the smoldering hypothesis as a final hypothesis. And really have some discussions. What's the cost going forward for this type of loss? They're usually quite high. So have those discussions with your forensic engineer on the front end. So some of the other things that we can do to really mitigate the scenes. Did we get there fast enough for you? Did we have the scene preserved? So are we using security, fencing? So we don't want to lose the transient and trifling evidence. So engage us on the front end rapidly, protect your scenes, make sure all the parties that are coming from both engineering staff that you've hired to the restoration companies, and let them know that the scene can't be impacted any further. And then discuss whether you need that laboratory analysis of the material that underwent ignition for the remaining pieces. So knowing the scope of your investigation and discussions with your adjuster, you're going to evaluate whether a further analysis is required, or quite simply, is the coverage there, there's no liability, subrogation isn't an answer, and the explanation on a scientific merit on the front end without any further testing is going to fit. Or if this is a file that's going to court, do you need to bring those into play and do some further testing? I'll leave you with this little short video, and I'll talk us through this video. Again, a substantial loss in Ontario. It's simply the result of a discarded cigarette into leaves along a fence line. There's no electrical conductors in this area along the fence line, and the outdoor shed behind the fence on the adjoining property doesn't have any electrical energized circuits within it either. The fire was unwitnessed until the fire reached the open flame portion of the phenomena. The fire's growth ignited the truck, and that truck then ignited the fence and then other cars that were parked on the lot. So there's a substantial dollar value to this fire. The statements gathered from everyone that was involved, including the person that took the video, it's very common that people pass by this specific corner on the fence, and people were seen smoking in this area on numerous occasions. The excavations by myself, I recovered smoker's debris along the fence line, and the exclusion of any natural phenomena. So the weather hadn't played a role in this fire, and the extrapolation of the scene produced cigarettes in the area. The car or the motor vehicle, this half-ton, was ruled out because the witness to the fire was early enough to state that the truck wasn't on fire first, and that the video that they took was after they got excited, and it was already then igniting from that fence line. So it was able to, we were able to classify this as a carelessly discarded smoker's material. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone. If you have any questions, I think we'd like to take them at this point.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. Appreciate it. We've got questions coming in now. We have about 5 minutes to respond to them, so we'll jump right into them. For anyone that does have questions, please feel free to submit them in the GoToWebinar console there under the questions box. All right, first question. In the mother/son smoking incident, how did you know about the surveillance? And yeah, so how did you find out about the surveillance, and what steps were taken to secure the video?
So the surveillance video came about by camera placements on other locations in the yard. I noticed them on their laneway. I noticed them on the front of the house, and then I was able to establish one that was in an unaffected position in the rear yard. Spoke to the adjuster. We got consent from the insured parties to recover the video. The player itself was inside the home. With their consent, we were actually able to plug it into my truck, review the video on scene, and once we reviewed that under informed consent, they changed their statement, and that assisted us with the investigation. But it was all done under consent.
Okay. Was there any sort of, are you aware of any subrogation against the son for not for failing to put out the cigarette? Are you aware of those details or not?
Yeah, I am aware. This file has been concluded. There's been no subrogation, and the claim's been paid, and they've moved on from that point.
Next question. Wondering about light combustible materials such as paper and cardboard in recycling and garbage bins. Can they be ignited by cigarettes?
Again, we have to understand the geometry of that fuel load within those within those confines of waste paper baskets. We have to understand whether it's shredded material, whether it's paper on its whole, how it's placed into it, what the air entrainment is over it. Yes, it can happen, but it's a lot more difficult for it to transition through a smoldering phase through those elements if they're whole pieces of paper.
Okay, great. Next question. What is meant by an ion count? How do we determine the ion count in a particular type of furniture? Why is the ion count higher in new furniture?
So each manufacturer has a list of the materials used in their products. The ion count is refers to how the fabric itself is constructed, and the ions are within that fabric itself. So as you use the furniture, you're breaking down that fabric, so the ion count is less. The newer the fabric, so the less use it has coming right out of the manufacturer's facility, the material is not broken down yet, and it's not as readily accepted of the smoldering phase transition.
Great. Is it possible to tell how old cigarette butts are when they are found in fire debris?
No, you really can't tell the age of the cigarette. As we spoke, it's been my experience that suppression water will move them around in the room, but to actually identify the specific cigarette within the debris that brought about the phenomena is hard. The fact that you do find them within that debris. So when you entrain, and again, we didn't have enough time today, but if I was to show you a photo of a perfectly formed smolder wave through our fuel medium or the substrate, which is the polyurethane foam, you would see that those materials, if they're not altered and caught quick enough in the fire scene development, that you'll find them below that isolated fuel cell.
Cool. Great. We've got a lot of questions coming in, but we have hit our time. Please feel free to continue submitting your questions, guys. I'm going to keep the window open and we'll make sure that we email you in the next day or two. I have Peter Hamilton's contact information here on the screen. Please feel free to take it down, email him, give him a call. If you have any losses that require forensic investigation in that Atlantic Canada area, the whole region, Peter's hopping all around there, along with our other teammates, our other forensic investigators out there. Please stay safe, and thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day. And thank you again, Peter.
Thank you very much for allowing me your time, everyone. I hope there's some great takeaways from today's seminar, and please feel free to contact me at any time. I'm here to help. I'm here to explain today's webinar also in a little bit more detail. Okay, thank you very much and have a safe 2021.
Thanks, Peter, you too.